Everyone's muted, including me. That was exciting. Let's go back to sharing my screen. So there were some great things that were put on the Jamboard as far as what people are doing that follows under some of these different ideas. So there's definitely some things where we're trying to help students evaluate with like exit tickets and rubrics. Some self-assessments or diagnostic exercises to help these figure out paths. Communicate achievement status with like focused written goals or tests or paradix or rubrics. There were connecting the learning to the real world by like trying to get things to motivate students to learn. And many of you took these in different ways than we thought about them as well. Rubrics and one-on-ones. So there's a lot of different things that people came up with on how they can fulfill some of these different goals of grades. And I'm going to try to put me back to
this is awesome. Love it.
The
more PBL, definitely
more PBL. I'm trying to get myself back to the presentation. There we go. Is that showing the tabs at the top again, Dustin, or is it?
It is, yeah, but you know what? It's all right. We'll survive.
Whoops, there it goes. All right. So one of the things that came up for us when we were thinking about this is, were all of these categories compatible? So if I go back to the categories themselves, like communicating achievement and helping students self-assess might not necessarily work together. So Dustin, can you go into this for just a second while I address my daughter?
Yeah. So yeah, some of these, they are kind of contradictory to each other at times, or can be at least. And so communicating achievement of learning and student self-assessment, those could go together, or they could, depending on how they're used, sometimes that communicating achievement can actually stop the process of self-assessment. I think it's really important to have students self-assess before we give a judgment, because as soon as we give a judgment, I've noticed students tend to shut down and stop thinking about themselves, and they just say, oh, I am this, whatever it might be.
Yeah, so some of these are kind of contradictory, and what we want to think about as we go through this is, when we think about what we're using grades for, we want to think about whether they're sort of equitable or not equitable. Go ahead, Dustin.
Yeah, and that they're all on a spectrum, right? Every practice we do in the classroom, every single one is on a spectrum of some kind, right? Some are less equitable, some are more equitable. It would be awesome if we could do all these like super equitable things every single day. And you know what? This is also real life and real world, and that's not always going to be the case. So we just try to do it as much as possible. But the way I think about equitable grading is that the tasks or the way we assess our students, if the assessment's on compliance and behavior, like, are you showing up on time? Are you turning things in on time? That kind of stuff, that tends to be less equitable. Whereas if we're focusing on what are you learning? How are you growing? What are the skills that you can do? Those are the techniques and skills that tend to be more equitable. And so again, there are some times when your building will say you have to grade on this. And if you have to grade on tardiness, then you have to grade on tardiness. Like, that's kind of how it goes. But we try to make that shift over to more equitable as much as possible. And for me, it's like thinking about jobs. It's compliance behavior-based jobs are the factory jobs, right? They're the ones, the lower paid kind of jobs that we tend to stick students into when they aren't one of the elite crew, the ones that aren't going to go out to college and do the ivory tower stuff. And so I want all of my students to learn and grow their entire life, no matter what job they do. Doesn't matter if they're in a trade or not. I mean, they really require a lot of critical thinking skills. So I think our critical thinking skills should be the focus.
Yeah, and just along those same lines, when I used to work at Intel before I was a teacher, and I remember one session where we were trying to interview people, and I interviewed someone, and they asked me what my opinion was, and I said, well, They said that whatever we wanted them to do, they would do it. And that's all that they would do. And they did not get an offer because they were willing to do complete compliance, right? They weren't really willing to do any of their own self-directed work versus like going back to the trades, folks who are really interested in understanding woodworking at a deep level are these artisans that get paid lots and lots of money and are, still getting to work out of their homes. All right.
So many of you may know this book already. This is Joe Feldman's Grading for Equity. And this is only one model. There's lots of people out there writing books and having talks about grading, but Joe Feldman has definitely put things together in a really nice way. It's certainly the first book I wrote. And he breaks it down into these 3 pillars, as he calls them: accuracy, bias resistant, and motivational. All grades should be accurate. They should be resistant to bias. There's no such thing as bias proof. That's been long proven, but as much as resistant as possible. And then motivational. And to me, motivational is the one that really stirs up my emotions, because I want my students to still feel like they have a shot. They have a chance at doing well in class. And again, especially I'm thinking about those historically underrepresented students and the students that historically just haven't done well in our educational system. So, does failure motivate, right? Does it motivate a student to get an F on a test? It does for some, definitely does for some, right? There are a set of students where either it's because their parents, they will hold their feet to the fire, or it's because internally they don't want to have that mark. But for a lot of students, once they get enough Fs in their educational career, they just start giving up and they stop even trying. So, and that's true for historically underserved students, is that they often interpret that failure as an indication that they don't belong here. They don't belong in the educational system. And so what's the point of even being there? This, one of our districts in Lane County, they did a survey of students and asked them about grades and motivation. So how does getting a low grade in your class affect your motivation? And this was one of the quotes. There were many, but this is one. Low grades make me feel annoyed, because if I put in the work to learn about it and know it, then I get a bad grade on it. I'm like, damn, was that even worth it? I just thought that was such a great, honest student answer. I certainly have been there myself, where I've tried really hard and then I get an F or even a D or whatever on the assignment. I'm like, oh, all that work. And so if the focus is on the letter, then I think we're missing the point, right? Focusing on the letter grade is not what it's about. Failure is super important in life. We need to be able to fail and still then go from there and learn from it and then keep moving forward and not be so willing to give up. So yeah, just leave it with that. What's next? Oh, sorry. So with all that said, now here's a purpose of grading from Education First. They say a grade is to communicate honestly and accurately in relation to where students are in their learning journey at a specific point in time. And so by specific point in time, it's like maybe it's week 2, but maybe it's week 12, maybe at the end of your quarter, and it's time to give that grade. And to honestly and accurately reflect where that student is at week 12, sometimes that's very different than where they were at week 2 or at 4 or even at 8 or 10. And that's, I think, important for us to get in our heads, because I was very much if you got an F on the first test, that would hurt your final grade. But if that student then learns that content by the time the final comes, maybe their grade should be higher. Maybe it is something like that first F, if that, assuming the final actually still has some of that content from the first test on there, we might need to reassess what their grade is and raise it up.
And so along those lines, you don't have to take this purpose of grades. You need to figure out what your ideal match is for grade. So what's your narrative for grade? And what do you need to do to make that work? And so I'm reading in the chat, Lori says, wouldn't it be ideal if we had a narrative for grades? Yeah, for our narrative about grades. So our system could change for teachers to be able to say like, hey, you've learned this much, you've gone this far, you've done this. And there's different ways that folks have sort of looked at grading in order to make that happen.
All right. So finally, we're getting into some of the techniques and some of the particular practices. And we just have 4, although we kind of cheated and there's a couple embedded into each one of these things. There are links. So in the slide deck, if you have it, these links will take you to a website that I made. Well, I started making it last spring. As I was reading this book, I just started putting the ideas in. But as a teacher, I said, I want to know, when I'm working with my teachers, because they're overwhelmed right now, I want to know which of these strategies are really easy to implement, or at least not necessarily easy, but they don't take much time for the teacher to do it. And then which ones are going to take a lot of time to implement. And so I broke it out in 3 groups: a little bit of time, a lot of time, or little to no time, a little more time, and then a lot of time. And so here are the 3 of them. I think there's one more.
Yeah, there are more. Just having trouble.
So grading only summative assessments, right? All those formative things like homework and classwork, they don't need to be graded. And honestly, like when I was told that, I'm like, wait a second, I spent so many hours grading that stuff. And what if we didn't have to grade any of that? And all we graded was just the final tests. And we didn't count that stuff, right? So just their learning.
And there's other ways there's other things you can do with that, like have them self-assess on it, or have them, mark it up themselves in class. It saves you time and they get more learning out of it. Go ahead.
Yeah, give them the answers, right? So here are the answers. I don't just make sure you know how to do it, right?
Write yourself a note for the next time you have to do it when it really matters. You know how to.
So obviously not penalizing for late work, showing up late, no points for participation or professionalism grades, group assignments by standard, not by task. And that one is hard to wrap your head around sometimes, because sometimes you have an assignment or an assessment that has multiple standards in it. So you do, if you're going to do that one, you do need to break that assessment up by standard so you know which standard they're still working on. So
and what a lot of people do for this grade learning, not behavior, is they bucket their behavior in a different category. I mean, if we're talking about what it's like to work outside of education, right? How people treat behavior issues and performance issues is different, right? If I go in and I botch a presentation in front of my boss, I get my boss to tell me like what I did wrong. We go over, how do I do it right next time? If I don't show up for work multiple times, I'm fired. So how we treat it in outside of education is different. So bucketing them separately in education is also okay. And what I find is like, if you bucket behaviors that you think are behaviors linked to success, and the student is successful and not exhibiting those behaviors, maybe just maybe they aren't really the behaviors of success.
Yeah.
And that's okay to bucket them differently and say, hey, you're not doing these things, but that apparently doesn't matter to you. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. That's a real tough one. As a middle school teacher in particular, when I'm trying to teach behaviors, a lot of behaviors in middle school, that's a tough one. But it's real. There are definitely students who don't necessarily need to do homework and still can do quite well in class. At least in that particular class. They might do homework in another class. All right, so all of these we go into much more depth on it. All of these things, grading on a 4-point scale and allowing retakes, all that on that website. So if you want to dig in more later, feel free to do that. Yeah, but I think Andrew's going to start talking a little bit more like what does a couple of these really look like in depth.
And also, like, if you want more about it, there's a 3-hour webinar that the Portland Metro STEM Association is also putting on that you can sign up for if you want more interest on them too.
And that's for anybody in the state.
Yes.
And
I believe they pay you to show up.
Yeah, you get paid. So that's pretty cool.
All right. So stop grading assignments. What does this look like? So, the students who didn't do assignments in middle school and failed are the same students that are not doing assignments in high school, right? Like failing them didn't make them start doing assignments. And even the other students who were like, okay, I got to do assignments to pass. Well, they might have a dip when they realize, okay, you're not grading any of these things. That's okay. It's okay to have a short dip, but then you got to bring them back. we don't, we're not here because we're getting an A to show up to this webinar. You don't reflect on your practice for that. Oh, basketball players don't practice free throws because it's super engaging to do the same thing over and over and over again. Hours. They do it so that they can get better. And that aha moment, that point where the dip turns back up again, is that moment when students realize, oh, the reason I'm doing this homework, the reason I'm doing this practice, the reason I'm doing this work in class is so that I can get better and do it when it counts. And we have to show this to students. And there's several different ways to show this. And I saw some of these on the Jamboard and in the chats. One of them is pre-post assessments. You give them an assessment at the very beginning of the unit, and you give them one at the end, and they can say like, oh, at the beginning, I'm going to learn all this stuff. And that's what I'm going to learn. And I need to do the practice on balancing equations or forces in motion or evolution, because that's what I don't understand. And then when I get to the summative assessment, I know what I was supposed to be learning along the way. You can label each section of that pre-assessment if you have time with the activity that's going to teach them, hey, on day 2, we're going to learn this part. So make sure you're really paying attention on day 2, because that's really going to help you with the parts that you don't understand. You can have them grade their own pre-tests and make notes for their areas of growth. So what I've seen teachers do along this line is say, hey, I've got a pre-test, or even I've seen them do this on the summative assessment before a retest. Go through it as a class. Circle the words that are the important words to really understand what's going on here. Underline equations or important information. Make notes to yourself in a different color of what you really would want to know in order if you're going to redo this, or what pieces do you need to learn in order to get it right the next time. So as they're making notes, they're focusing themselves on where they need to learn. So that's that pre-post assessment. And that blue marker test review is what I was talking about on a summative assessment. After the test is done, but before it's graded, you give a color marker that they didn't use on their test. They talk about what happened, keywords, information, what happened. You get students to, when I saw this done, they were going through the test and they said, okay, pat yourself on the head if you know the answer to this question or where to go. And if there's not enough people patting themselves on the head, that means that a lot of people didn't really get it. And have a little discussion with your neighbor about how you might approach this. Make sure you're writing some notes down to yourself. Talk about those strategies to solve the problems. And then before they do a retake, they can look at that and they can see, okay, I wrote those notes before I ever got a grade. Now that I have a grade, which of those notes do I need to pay the most attention to retake this? And expect everyone to make a note. Everybody, whether they're going to get an A on the test or not, still has room for growth. And it's important to underline that for all the students who are there. And then the last, another strategy that helps is the retake test ticket. And so let's say retaking a test is not a given right. It's a privilege you earn, and you earn that privilege by doing something that will make the outcome different than the time you took it before. And multiple people who have done this say like, hey, having a retake ticket for your class or for your district or for your school that's pretty consistent about, here's the work I did before to prepare for this. This is what I'm going to do different to prepare next time, whether it's review these, finish this work, get some help from a teacher to understand what's going on, get some help from another student. And then once that's done, then they get to retake it, because they should get a different outcome after they've done something different.
I've even seen teachers have a retake pass that the student fills out. Here's my name. Here's the thing I did to study for it. Here it is to the teacher now. I'm ready to go. And sometimes those reassessments can be, people, oh, I have to remake an entire test. You don't have to, especially if you're teaching by standard. If there's one standard the student didn't get, you can just quickly say, okay, you ready? Okay, so tell me about what are the phases of the moon? Tell me what you know, and just do a quick little verbal assessment right there, and you can just be done with it, grading and everything.
Yeah, or explain to me how you would balance this equation, or explain to me, here's somebody who did something wrong. Explain to me what they did wrong and how you would do it differently. Yeah,
love that.
Okay, to look at the chat. There's some really cool things about like having discussions about whether something is formative or summative. That's a really interesting conversation to have with students, especially around like getting them involved in the learning process. The more you get the students involved in the learning process, the more you pull back the veil, is what Joe Feldman talks about. Make learning accessible and understandable about what this process is, so that it's not just I do stuff, I give it to this black box teacher and the teacher gives me back a letter and I take letter and go, right? It's there's more to it, that it's about their education. All right. So let's go to this Jamboard. Do we have time for that? We only have 15 minutes left. So maybe just we'll have people go there for 3 minutes and we'll just stay online here. Drop the Jamboard in the chat for anybody who doesn't have the presentation, assuming that it's the same Jamboard we had a minute ago, but you are now on, you know, slide here where do you help students learn? So I'll just drop the link in the chat while you guys are.
I can do that. Almost.
I beat you to it.
Oh, dang it.
So I see one on there. Relate learning in the classroom to learning in sports or a hobby. That's good. What else do we do to help students learn? Yeah, the learning log is a really good one. You could have them like every day. So what did I learn towards the goals?
I have a teacher right now they're doing a weekly self-assessment. So here's the goal for the week. Here's the learning objective for the week. What do you know? What did you learn about this week? What assignment best shows your learning? That's their assessment.
Writing math paragraphs and feedback and revision cycles. So yeah, like normalize revision. That's an important one. Normalize revision, because students get this idea that once they've turned it in, they're done. And if we normalize everyone does revision, and revision is part of our life, redoing things to make it better, that's great. Rough draft math, that's
Actually,
great.
there was a study that was done on as soon as a teacher puts a grade on an assignment, the learning stops on that assignment. They, like you said, Andrew, they take that grade and they go home with it, but it's done to them. If you don't put a grade on it, they still think about if they'll take feedback and they'll try to change the feed or work on the feedback while they're trying to get.
Yeah, and if you're having problems adding things to the Jamboard, you can add it to the chat. That's great too. Model how to study. Also, another good one along that line is model making mistakes. If you model making mistakes and what you've done to fix those mistakes, you make it more okay for students to make mistakes. Like I've gone in and told my class, hey, I was teaching this and I made a mistake, or you guys told me I made a mistake. Let's look about how to fix that, right? That's powerful for them.
It is.
Making more options, more personal motivating. So they feel like it's part of their life and just something you told them to do. That's good. Graphic organizers are good. It helps them figure out how things fit together. I like write their own quiz questions. That really gets them thinking about, from a teacher perspective, like if they're thinking like a teacher, then they're learning it in a different way. All right.
Be careful with that one though. They will ask hard questions. Really hard questions.
Don't take the really hard ones that they've written and use them always. Or talk about the super hard ones in class, right? Those are great.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go back to the presentation. You guys can continue to add to that because you'll have access to that Jamboard after this. And then what I want to do is just go through the resources that are here. There is the Equitable Grading website that Dustin put together in Lane County that you're welcome to look at to get some ideas on. The Equitable Grading webinar hosted by the Portland Metro STEM Center is open to anyone across the state of Oregon. They have funding to pay teachers across the state if anyone wants to attend that. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can click on the link. I believe it was also dropped in the chat so that you can sign up, and when that date is set, we'll send that out to you. It's usually on a Saturday morning. There's some books that we thought were great. I loved, of course, Grading for Equity. I'm enjoying the Get, Set, Go by Tom Guskey. I like things like Susan Burkhart's always great. This Matt Townsley site is awesome. It has resources and rubrics for every subject under the sun, as well as what that looks like for them.
If you haven't listened to Rick Bromelli talk before,
Yeah.
he's funny to watch. I mean, he's a good performer. I'll say that. He's a good performer.
Also, Myron Duvak is another good one to listen to. He's got a lot of good stuff to say about equitable grading and standards-based grading, and he's fun to listen to, so that you listen to an hour and you're like, well, that's fun. Oh, wow, that was an hour, as opposed to some people that you're like, oh my gosh, that was 10 minutes. So,
but that wasn't us tonight.
Hopefully not. And then I'm going to go forward one slide. At the end of this, you also have Dustin's and I email if you want some more information on it. I'm going to leave it on this, and then I'm going to stop sharing and then see if anybody has any questions or comments or things you want to share.
And I know that was a big whirlwind. We just kind of 45 minutes to an hour is not much to talk about this topic.
Oh.
I see a question in the chat from Amanda. I wonder if you could answer that with your own experience about retakes.
So the thing about retakes, if there's no limit on like what they have to do to get it, to earn the retake, then it does seem like it's just a whirlwind of work for teachers. By making them do the retake ticket, or you're right, by limiting the number of retakes. I've heard people limit it to like 2 or 3, or like if the retake didn't work for you, then you need to do a different kind of assessment. So, but yeah, limiting it. So it's otherwise, if you don't make them have an exit, like some sort of retake ticket, or you don't limit the number of retakes, then you wind up with students rolling the dice with their retakes. And then it's a lot of work for teachers and not any use for students.
And I can't emphasize enough the value of just a verbal retake, especially if it's just one standard, because that can be really efficient to grade for you and for the student to dig into where their misconceptions are.
And if students have test anxiety, sometimes it's easier to just explain it to you, and then they show all of their learning, as opposed to, I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but I know I have at least once. Knew everything, walked into the room, sat down on the test, forgot everything.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a little easier when you're sort of having a conversation to be able to pull that out if that's a person that struggles with that test anxiety.
And I'm just going to follow up with Dustin said that on assessments, that when we were doing this in Beaverton, that we did organize our assessments by the standard, and then students only retook the part of the assessment that was on the piece of the standard that they missed. But we also, that was the only, like if they were in high school and were taking finals, they only took the final for the standard information that they were missing, like if they were not proficient. So we never had full content finals. We were like, okay, you need this standard and this standard. So we put out papers and it was like, this paper is for that standard, this paper is for that, this paper is for that. Pick up the one that you still need to be proficient on and put it together. That's your final. So that was like the final opportunity to meet the standard.
It's a little, I felt like it was different than teaching to the test when I've done that, just because it was like, hey, you still need to demonstrate that this is you're proficient at. And the conversation is how do I raise my grade? Well, it looks like you haven't demonstrated that you understand these things. How are you going to demonstrate them to me? You can take this test, or you can give me some other way to show that you've demonstrated that to me. And most of them in my classroom would do the test, but occasionally I would have people draw a picture or explain it to me, or find some other method that worked better for them. So if you're open to that and you have a little room for that, especially if you're only redoing, you miss these standards during final, you have more space for that.
Yeah, I had a student on an IEP who basically refused to write at all. And so we're like, hey, we'll type it out, but it just didn't work very well. Particularly, we were doing modeling, gas modeling, and so he couldn't do it. And so I'm like, record a video. Get your iPad out and just record a video and just talk me through whatever you know. And that worked beautifully. He clearly was listening. He knew just about everything. So that made it a little easier. Yeah, so being flexible on those assessments types, that can be really powerful. Yeah, and I guess I think of it less as teaching to the test, more teaching to the standard. Teaching to the standards, I would say, sure, yeah. If you don't know how to balance an equation, then let's practice balancing equations and get that standard met.
Yeah, if you don't understand forces of motion, can I really say that you really understand physics? Or if you don't understand how to communicate science, that's a problem.
I know another thing that we are thinking about is that idea of multiple ways of showing what you know. And I think Dustin was touching on that a good model or concept map can sometimes relay as much information as a written paragraph on an item and can help it support, especially our ESL students who are often graded lower because of the language difficulty for them, as opposed to the conceptual knowledge. That they have the concept, the science concept, and if they can draw a model and show that they understand like kinetic molecular motion through that drawing, that you know that they've gotten that concept. So I think that that's something that we're trying out more and more now.
Really appreciate that. Yeah, I certainly had plenty of students in middle school who who struggle to express themselves in the written language. Now, it's an important skill, absolutely. But if I'm assessing on their scientific knowledge, their written skills shouldn't get into that way, unless it's explicitly, if I'm doing a claim evidence reasoning, well, that's about written knowledge, written skills. That's something different. But if it's just about the knowledge, it should be separate. Thank you for that, Susan. Other thoughts, ideas, questions?
I just want to make sure that people saw in the chat that there is an exit survey for OSTA to get your PDU hour for this webinar, and that it will take about